my name is Samantha Crandall. I'm a student at Florida Southern College in the Masters of Education program. This is my thesis proposal presentation for EDU 6010 with Dr. Martha Santiago. For my thesis, I decided to look at the effects of positive behavior as a social growth support for children in poverty. One of the biggest things I decided to look at when I was doing this study was how can the implementation of school-wide positive behavioral supports affect the social growth of children in poverty? Before I go any further into this presentation, I want to be clear what I mean when I say school-wide positive behavioral supports. Throughout my presentation, you may see it referred to as SWPBS. School-wide positive behavioral supports are the process of changing behaviors in a school or a district by teaching behavioral expectations in the same way that a teacher would teach a core curriculum, such as math, reading, or science. By doing this, the teacher should be able to create a safe and orderly learning environment in the classroom, as well as improving the social, emotional outcomes of students. School-wide positive behavioral support systems best work when there are clear behavioral expectations developed that are then taught to the students. Then appropriate behavior is acknowledged whenever it occurs in the classroom, and likewise inappropriate behavior is consistently corrected. Then the behavioral data that is gathered from using the school-wide positive behavioral support plan can be used to systematically solve problems. It is research-based and it lends to administrative decision-making purposes. This means administrators in the school have a better idea what to do to handle problem behaviors in the classroom because teachers have provided what is most frequently occurring. The purpose of this study is to eliminate problematic social behaviors that are common in Polk County School District's lower socioeconomic classrooms using school-wide positive behavioral supports. In this study, we're looking particularly at the problem behaviors of name-calling, chronic bullying, disrespect to adults and peers, and fighting. By using school-wide positive behavioral supports, we aim to equip students with stronger social skills. They also need to learn coping mechanisms to better prepare them for life beyond school. We also aim to prevent any further behavior issues in the classroom or outside of the classroom. The problem that we face when dealing with school-wide behavioral support systems in lower socioeconomic schools is behaviorally at-risk students need a method of intervention to prevent problem behaviors from being carried into their further educational pursuits. When I say further educational pursuits, I'm talking about not only their primary education, but into their secondary and post-secondary schools if they choose to go that far. This intervention must foster social growth, so students may acquire these lacking social skills and these positive behavioral habits that they're going to need for life in general. There are many indicators of students who are behaviorally at risk. So to clarify, the three that are most common in Polk County schools are living below the federal poverty guideline, which is determined by the U.S. Census Bureau and the U.S. Department of Commerce. The second indicator is coming from a family with marital distress, and the third is having parents who suffer from depression. There are many shocking statistics surrounding these students who are behaviorally at risk, and one of these is that having these three indicators combined can make a student doubly at risk for having social-emotional problem behaviors. And this is not only in primary, but like I said, in secondary and post-secondary educational pursuits. Students who are disadvantaged by poverty alone, so excluding the issues of marital distress and parental depression, are 5 times more likely to drop out of school early than other students. This is why it's so important that students have a method of early intervention so that their educations are not plagued by behavioral problems that make them end up not being able to complete their degrees. Based on the new Florida State class size addendum, the standard classroom has 22 students. So using that number, nearly a quarter of the students in a single Polk County classroom are at risk due to toxic stressors caused by their financial circumstances. These toxic stressors are homelessness, hunger and food insecurity, absent or criminal parents, domestic violence, and drug abuse. When I say a toxic stressor, I don't mean just a simple stress that a student may experience in their day-to-day life, but these major stressors that cause a student to lack focus in the classroom, as well as possibly lack the social skills and the coping mechanisms to be able to socially interact with students, whether their peers are experiencing the same toxic stressors or not. I hypothesized that using this study, I should be able to show a decrease in the amount of problem behaviors that are exhibited in Polk County Schools' lower socioeconomic classrooms due to the successful implementation of a school-wide positive behavioral support plan. This study should result in a decrease in the number of negative behaviors that are exhibited in the classroom, as well as evidence that the school-wide positive behavioral support plan leads to students understanding what is acceptable behavior and allows them to learn the social skills that are needed in and out of the classroom. In this particular study, the students are using a color-coded chart that earns them rewards or consequences. So by using this study and the successful implementation of this plan, we should also be able to see that a higher percentage of students are earning the reward of visiting the principal's treasure box as opposed to the percentage of students that do not receive that reward. To formulate this study, I had to do a literature review. Some of the topics that I looked at were negative behavior prevalence in young adulthood, as well as negative behavior prevalence in adulthood. This then led me to look at children of poverty and the social statistics that surround them, the effects of school-wide positive behavioral support plans, and the importance of early intervention. When I was researching negative behavior prevalence in young childhood, I found a number of things that I found very interesting. One of these was that students of poverty have tendencies to externalize their negative behaviors much more frequently than students of a higher socioeconomic status. A number of the tendencies that were seen in a particular study included hitting, throwing things, having temper tantrums, hurting others, lacking the ability to share, and kicking. In a study by Holtz, Fox, and Muir that was conducted in 2014, they were able to determine that some of these activities that students externalize have a correlation to race. These certain activities include eating with a spoon, listening to adults, understanding adults, doing what is asked by both adults and peers, playing well with others, sleeping through the night, helping others, and eating well. Regardless of race, any of these activities could have an effect on a student's education. For example, sleeping through the night. If a student has not slept the night before they come to school, it's very likely that they will not be performing at their top ability. In this particular study, Holtz, Fox, and Muir were able to determine that African American children have to be nearly a year older than students that are either Latino or Caucasian to receive the same ratings regarding behavior on a 3-point Likert scale. I then decided to look at negative behavior prevalence in adulthood, and I found that adults who grow up having been children of poverty or a combination of poverty and neglect are at risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, and poor academic achievement. They are also at risk for high levels of crime in adolescence, and these include prostitution, violent behavior, and general delinquency. In another study by Bright and Johnson-Reed, which was conducted in 2008, they found that childhood poverty and neglect can act as predictors for some other activities. Child poverty and neglect are predictors for overall school performance, delinquency, criminal behavior, language and reading ability, school absences, school grades, suspensions, and dropout rates. So after looking at some of this information, I needed to find a theory that would suit what I was trying to answer in comparison to the data that already existed. What I found was the attribution theory. The attribution theory describes how the social perceiver uses information to arrive at causal explanations for events, as well as how and why people explain events the way that they do. The attribution theory also explains how we attach meaning to our behaviors. Using the attribution theory, learners are affected by both environmental factors and personal factors. Environmental factors may be their home or the school that they attend, while their personal factors are their prior knowledge or prior experience. Bernard Weiner, who helped to develop the attribution theory, stated that the understanding students have about the causes of past events influences their ability to control what happens to them in the future. So to clarify what I mean by the attribution theory and determining how students perceive different events and the causes, I have an example of a very typical thing that teachers might see in their classroom. And this is how a student reacts to taking a test. In the first example, a student attributes failing a test to a lack of effort or studying. If a student in the past has had good experiences in test taking when they have studied appropriately, they may be motivated to study harder. However, on the flip side of that, if a student attributes failing to a lack of ability or his or her health issues, he or she may not be motivated to study harder or make an effort and assume that any previous success is just by chance or luck. Therefore, the student decides what his or her next action is based on his or her perception of what is acceptable. Now, this relates to children of poverty because they're lacking social skills. If a student lacks a social skill or does not understand what behavior is inappropriate or appropriate in a classroom or out of classroom setting, he or she does not have the appropriate basis to decide what his or her next action is. Therefore, an intervention is necessary so that the students can learn what is appropriate and what is not appropriate and make better and more informed decisions when choosing actions in the future. So when developing this particular study, I had to come up with a methodology that included a research design, a selection of sample, time frame, data collection, data analysis, and the interpretation of data. So when coming up with a research design, I felt that for this particular study, a mixed methods design would be best suitable. That means I would need both qualitative and quantitative data to accurately report what happened during the implementation of my school-wide positive behavioral support plan. For qualitative data, I would require verbal descriptions of social growth of students in different grades from multiple ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds. And this information would come from parents or guardians and educators. Also, quantitative data, which is numerical, would need to be collected to express the change or the lack of change in social misconduct in comparison to data from previous years. These years would be ones where school-wide positive behavioral supports were not implemented. We would also be comparing the number of office discipline referrals to previous years. To select the students that I would use for this particular study, I decided that I would need a school population that is deemed in extreme poverty. So perhaps 98% of the students would be from families that are living below the federal guidelines. So, like I said, these federal poverty guidelines are determined by the U.S. Census Bureau and the U.S. Department of Commerce based on the area where the students live. I would want to choose a school that is considered an F school based on the previous year's FCAT or FSA data, and where there is a wide range of behavioral problems. So it may be something as simple as bullying or name-calling, or as severe as threats or acts of violence against peers or adults. The students that I would choose for this study would need to be the most at-risk behaviorally and the most at-risk to fall into certain statistical categories that have been presented in my previous research. These students would be 47 non-ESE students split between 2 classes in a Polk County elementary school, and they would be in the 4th grade. I estimated that this study would take at least a year to conduct appropriately. This would be because teachers would need a few weeks to be trained and adjust to the implementation of the program, followed by time to get together data from the prior year, and then compare the new data to that year's data. There would also need to be time to conduct monthly open-ended question sets, as well as monthly closed-ended Likert scale responses, and daily logs that are filled out by the teachers to show what the movement was across the school-wide positive behavioral support color-coded plan that would be given out to be used with this study. To collect the data quantitatively, I would need to have parents and teachers fill out different open-ended question sets on a monthly basis to show what the students' behavioral changes are. When I say an open-ended question set, I mean where there is not a formed answer, such as a multiple choice assessment. The parent or the guardian or teacher would have the ability at will to fill in their own answer based on their own perception of a student's behavior. Some of the questions that I would ask would be, what problem behaviors is the student still exhibiting? What problem behaviors is the student exhibiting less frequently? And what problem behaviors are being no longer exhibited by the student? I would also have to have parents and teachers respond to close-ended question sets. So these would be based using a Likert scale, which is a frequency scale that measures attitudes or opinions with a fixed choice. So they would be given the options 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, where 1 means never and 5 means always. So a couple examples of questions that I would ask for this closed-ended question set might be, how often does the student become involved in physical altercations with peers? How often does the student become involved in verbal altercations with adults? Or how often does the student partake in name-calling? Quantitatively, the teachers whose classrooms will be involved in this study will be responsible for collecting the data. Therefore, the research is reliant on teachers collecting data accurately. They will be given charts to log a student's movement down the school-wide positive behavioral support color-coded plan, and they will be able to note which negative behavior required that child to be moved down the chart. Then the data from these charts will be used to determine what is the frequency of particular behaviors in the classroom. And then we can use the proper administrative steps to reduce those behaviors. The qualitative data will be collected, and it will need to satisfy the principle of triangulation, which means increasing the trust and validity of the conclusions that are made by the researchers. To do this, the researcher would need to analyze the transcribed open-ended question sets in relation to the quantitative data gathered to determine if the Likert scale responses reflect the same occurrences of problem behaviors that are rewarded or punished using the school-wide positive behavioral support plan and the teacher's logs. The quantitative data that will be collected using the Likert scale and the teacher's daily behavior movement logs will need to be closely analyzed. I would compile the numerical data into categories based on an individual problem behavior, such as bullying others, and then formulate a monthly average to determine the frequency of an individual problem behavior in the classroom. At the conclusion of the study, the findings made based on both the quantitative and the qualitative data throughout the duration of the implementation of this school-wide positive behavioral support plan will be interpreted by compiling the numerical data into categories based on individual problem behaviors and then transcribed into easily readable charts and graphs, so that anyone who wanted to access this research would be able to see how the frequency decreased or did not decrease based on the results of the study. Again, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch my thesis proposal, and I hope that it is able to help you in some way in your classroom in reducing problem behaviors.